Hi, everyone. I'm Josh Rothus. I'm the publisher of Sublunary Editions. I am going to be your host, my duties for which will mostly be staying out of the way after these introductions. We are here to talk about two new books from Daniela Cascella. We have Chimeras, published by Sublunary Editions, a book very near and dear to me. This is a book that echoes so well with so much of our output, a book that deals with translations and the silences around translations, both the untranslatable and the untranslated. This is a book that takes the vacuum of silence as a form around which to scaffold various forms of writing that ultimately leads to a new way of engaging, I think, with works that are distant in one way or another. We're also going to be talking about Nothing as We Need It, which was released over the summer by Punctum Books on their Risking Education imprint. Daniela is an Italian-British writer. She works with forms and transformations of critical writing that inhabit, echo, are haunted by their subjects. I think you'll find very quickly both of these books fit that description very nicely. She has also published Singed, which is out from Aarhus Press, as well as two books on the Zero Books imprint. This is FMRL, Footnotes, Mirages, Refrains, and Leftovers on Writing Sound, and In a Beam, Listening, Reading, Writing, and Archival Fiction. She is going to be joined in conversation by Jennifer Hodgson, who you may know as previously the editor-at-large of White Review, as well as the UK editor for Dalkey Archive Press. In 2018, she edited The Unmapped Country from And Other Stories, which is a compendium of fragments and stories by Anne Quinn. She's also working on a new nonfiction book drawing on her long engagement with Anne Quinn's writing and life. As an academic researcher, she works on experiments in narrative and other kinds of human self-telling and co-led a study into voice hearing and literary creativity. I'm going to turn it over quickly because I really, so one quick note, we're not going to do a Q&A. This is going to be a pure conversation between Daniela and Jen. I think you will find that an excellent way to spend an hour. So I'm going to get to that quickly. I'm going to turn it over first to Emil Boyesen, who, along with Ansgar Allen, is the editor of the Risking Education imprint at Punctum Books. Emil, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. I think Ansgar is actually here as well, so I hope he doesn't mind me speaking for both of us. Hi, Ansgar. Really pleased to be here and excited to be able to launch Daniela's Nothing as We Need It for Risking Education, which is the imprint, as Josh said, on Punctum. So with Risking Education, we really wanted to try to set up a series that dealt with educational questions, educational ideas, educational ways of communicating that completely destroyed traditional, typical, and commonplace ways of thinking about education. And when we received Daniela's proposal for her book, and then eventually, read the manuscript, we were astounded at not just how incredible the book is, how it draws from so many different writers that we're really passionate about, writers we didn't know about, that we learned about through the book, engaged in forms of communication, especially conversation, that just exploded the idea of education, educational relation, and the educational subject. We couldn't think of a more appropriate book to launch the series. So we're really grateful to Daniela for sending this to us and for the opportunity to publish it. And I think, I don't want to say too much more because I want to give as much time as possible to Daniela and Jennifer to have their conversation, because I can't wait to hear it. So thank you very much, Josh and Daniela, and looking forward to hearing the conversation.
And Daniela and Jen, take it away.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Hi, Daniela.
Hello.
Do you mind, Daniela, if I start by embarrassing you a little bit? In a really nice way. You're going to enjoy it.
Welcome. Yes, please.
I should say, in the spirit of full disclosure, that I'm allowed to embarrass Daniela, because Daniela has been a pal of mine and one of my very favourite and most important interlocutors for about 8 or 9 years now, right? And as I was preparing for this evening and reading these two new books, I was trying to think of the right words to sort of pay tribute to what her project is doing. And all the words that were coming to mind were like really cheesy. It was like, oh, you know, audacious, swaggering, hugely ambitious. And they weren't the right words at all. So I just simply want to say what a pleasure it is when a friend of yours, you know, you get the sense that a friend of yours is doing exactly the thing that they're meant to be doing. You know, that they've kind of hit their stride, and they're you know, a writer who is really going for it. Just kind of is the sense that just comes off these two books, and it is just beautiful, really beautiful to see. And when I was reading these books, because I have the privilege of seeing behind the curtain a little bit, I was thinking back to the conversations that we were having while you were writing them. And I was remembering how lovely it was to hear kind of your I guess your excitement and your joy and your kind of like sometimes slightly jittery sense of like illicitness around the writing of these. I know we would be on the phone and you would be like telling me, you know, you'd be like, I'm writing this crazy thing, this totally deranged thing. And you there was such like joy and pleasure in the way that you spoke about it. So I wonder, for the benefit of everyone else, if to kick off, you could just tell us a bit about the where this project came from and the beginnings of it.
Thank you, Jen. Can I faint on Zoom? No, I can't. So yeah, it's a really important question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it in full. I think I started writing these books a long time before I started writing these books. I think that they address a number of ideas and questions and desires and drives that have been with me for a long time. And I can see some of the seeds of these books in the first one that I published in English, but even earlier than that, even in some of the work that I did in Italian before I started even thinking of myself as somebody who wrote in English. Formally, I knew that this was a really important step for me. And I must say that let's not forget about the structural circumstances when these things can happen. I was fortunate enough to have 3 years of time to spend on this work. Mm-hmm. And I had a PhD scholarship, and Sharon Kivland, who's here, whom I thank for being my patient supervisor all these years. It was a privilege. It's very different when you can write for yourself and don't have to worry about placing the writing somewhere. You write because you're pushing the work, but it doesn't need to exist anywhere else than your own space. Mm. And I think that's where a good part of the daring, the formal daring happened. To have the freedom to say, you know, I don't have pressure. I can't separate the conditions of the writing from what happened during those years. There was definitely a number of problems with my previous books, and I think they are formal problems as well as, you know, thought problems or thematic problems or theoretical problems, and you can't separate the two. And I think what the form does in these two carries a lot of the arguments that I want to communicate. there was definitely a lot of questions around an intense period of time that I spent in conversation with particularly 3 writers. Maybe we'll get to them later, but Cristina Campo, Alejandra Pizarnik, and Roberto Galasso, and the realization that a lot of the work that I was reading was not available in English, had not been translated into English. So there was this resistance of the material, and especially in certain contexts where you're expected to show evidence and build your argument on visible quotations and all that. And, you know, so there was this really interesting question: what do you do when you can't really quote for an English readership? I mean, and not being somebody who, you know, I couldn't start translating. I mean, if I started translating, I wouldn't have written these books. So it was this really interesting place, I think, for me to be, in terms of the drive to engage with this material, but also the drive to give it to more readers. You know, so it's not just my own space. It was just this sense of wow, these writers are so important, and these books, these texts are so meaningful for whatever else I'm doing here, which whatever else is an interrogation of what critical writing can be and how it can be and what it can do. Again, when it starts drifting away from certain given forms and formats. So I think, yeah, the core of this was the question of how to write when there is nothing to say. How to write when there is apparently nothing to say, or for example, when there is so much that you're so close to the material that you're studying, you're so involved, even somatically, when there's so much that you become speechless. So there's different states of being overwhelmed in different ways. So we talk about the non-translated material, but I'd also like to talk about the emotionally close material, or the fact that certain writers say so much about a number of ideas and things that you want to say. So, you know, this is very, very uncomfortable position sometimes. So that's the other sense of being overwhelmed. The sense of being overwhelmed simply, well, not so simply, by meeting work, you know, by an aesthetic encounter that steals your words. So all these states of speechlessness, prompting the question of, yes, but how can I write? This question of, you know, well, we talked about it a lot in the last few years, when you got so much to say that you think you got nothing to say, or when you want to put yourself maybe in a different conversation with the material that is not the extractive reading, that is not the there is not the interpretive reading, that is not the that doesn't do that. When the writing doesn't do that, it wants to do something else. What do you do? What is it you do? So, and there were, I guess, a few challenges that I said to myself. I only wanted to write about texts that I felt it was impossible for me to write. You know, when you read something, you're like, oh no, I'll never be able to do anything with this. And of course, that's exactly why you go there.
Yeah.
I think I'll hand it over to you now.
There's so much. There's so much there. I mean, thinking about the kind of sources that you've used, I mean, there's this kind of refrain in the work about the sources that you're drawn to. You know, there's you're very keen on, like, avoiding or refusing established pathways, frameworks, you know, the usual frames of reference that people draw upon again and again. And equally, I think it's so interesting the way that you're thinking about these neglected writers, because, you know, there's that kind of like I mean, we're in this moment of the kind of rediscovery of like forgotten, quote unquote, lost writers or whatever at the moment. And there's a lot of kind of just quite, I mean, I've probably been guilty of this myself, but kind of quite flat, kind of banal, plain stuff spoken about, you know, I want to elevate these writers and bring them to a wider audience. And you're saying, you seem to be saying something about it's not about that, you know, there's a much more nuanced engagement with what it is to rescue or save something. There's a kind of like sense of the defense or protection of secrecy, of, you know, as you say, faint signals, of like the point here not being to like pretend that we can, you know, bring this to a wider audience and kind of act against the market or whatever. It being about faint signals being valid, and there's something like just so liberating and productive, and like that opens a new horizon about that. It's something, it's a bit like the way that you describe the process of recognition in the books, the way that it's a knowing something again that you already know, to think about that idea of the faint signal, and that is worth saving, and that is forever and permanent, and it is not lost. It just knocks me out every time.
I think I'm not here to rescue anyone. No, that's not my, yeah, I'm not here to rescue anyone. I think there's something about the conversation that you set up with certain materials, and the realization that certain writers emanate a very faint signal. It doesn't mean that it's not important. I'm just trying to say that we all have different modalities of doing what we do, and of modulating our voices. And some of us can't scream. You know what I mean? So, and if I'm reading somebody who in my ears and in my hearing doesn't scream, I'm not going to be the one who screams for them. And yeah, I think we're moving into really interesting oral metaphors here, which are quite appropriate. Yeah, but yeah, I think that certain tonalities and modulations should be respected like that. And I use the idea of the faint, yeah, the metaphor, the image of the faint signal, because I think that, again, I mean, certain voices otherwise would be distorted if you take the volume too high up. So there's definitely that, and there's definitely this sense of well, I remember the encounter with an installation by the German sound artist Rolf Julius, who works with these really small speakers placed on the floor, and you have to go very close to hear whatever it is that's being transmitted there. And I remember seeing this in a really big space in Berlin. So you had this contrast of scales between this huge hall and this tiny speakers scattered on the floor, and it became really important for me to see this and to hear this, but also thinking in terms of distribution rather than the loud wall speakers. So other modalities in terms of maybe you have something interesting to say and you say it 8 different times instead of saying it once loud. You're saying it 8 times in different parts of the books in a more hushed ways, and what happens there? What effects does it produce? And also, you know, if you don't have the means to own the wall of loudspeakers, read between the lines. But you know, if you don't have this powerful system behind you, what do? How do you keep transmitting these signals? So there's something about resistance, I think, and some sort of persistence also, and stubbornness even, perhaps. But also, I you know, there's a lot of in the books, there's quite a few neologisms that I used, and I used the voice from the faint speaker instead of the voice from the loudspeaker, which seems to be an effective way of, of using, finding a term that could say that, but just by defining one of the voices in the book as the voice from the faint speaker rather than the loudspeaker. What does it do to your imagination and how you're perceiving this voice?
I mean, we're already down the path, as you've said, of like talking about these metaphors of kind of the auditory, but perhaps we should backtrack a bit and talk about what it is to kind of, because one of the kind of major themes of your work has been this kind of reorientation of like the kind of sensory metaphors that we use for, reading and thinking, from those of sight and vision to the ear. And it's, so much is opened up as a result of that. I know you and I often talk about this kind of like sense of frustration with the kind of flat, dry, closed up text of the page, and by reorienting those kind of like metaphors of perception, consciousness, thought, so much is opened up there, as you say, with these resonances for a writing that can be still writing, but also more than it is,
Yeah. What else can I say? I think there was a lot of thinking behind this in terms of what if we think in terms of resonance instead of reference. And this is going back to the question of the text that you're working with, and the fact that some of them cannot be quoted. So how do you work with literature as material, as a resonant material? So how do you work? How do you look at literature? How do you write literature about literature in a way that is using resonance instead of reference? So in a way that explodes the boundaries of the quotation marks and does something else, and it's a lot more entangled and interfered with once you shift to that kind of perceptual mode that goes through that. I think that a lot can be shifted, like you're saying, and you listen to the page. Now this, of course I'm not the first one who's working in this field and who's using these ways of approaching literature. And I'm not going to give a lecture here, but a really important set of thoughts came to me by reading Michel de Certeau's The Mystic Fable, where he writes about how by tuning into the page and by thinking of writing as a transmission and by thinking of writing as a speaking to the page, mystic discourse became an alternative model of conversation and of transmission that disrupted the canons of the official church. So that's, he's looking at 16th, 17th century mystic writing from Spain. But that was really important for me, to read about this and to read about how certain texts had a completely different function when they were meant to be not just fixed entities, but something a lot more porous and a lot more open. Now, this is really important for us because there's this sense of something else that goes through the page, but it's not limited to the page. So that there's something about, and this is something that de Certeau does really well in those books, the fact that a text is articulated in the way it is articulated and takes the form that it takes can't be dismissed, because that's exactly what disrupts certain other forms and allows you to be hearing what goes on in the page. So this is, this was really, really important, as as an encounter for me, for my thinking, that prompted more work. I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't even remember the question. But...
It's fine, more than, yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was the form of the conversation, because there's a, we got 2 books, 2 participants in a conversation, this figure of 2, but like, I mean, I think you say dualism, not duality, not dualism, or the other way around, and these are like, these conversations, I mean, they're funny because there's so much interruption and so many, so much interference, and like the 2 voices not listening to one another, and this is not like a kind of like conversation that is reaching a happy accord. This is, it's a different kind of dialogue, and the in the opening of one of the books, you're staging a conversation, not just over your own, well, the figure of DC, the kind of author persona, a dead body, but a quartered body, and there's these, the figures of literature and the figure of chimera, like sat either side, arguing the toss. And I wonder how much, you've always been a writer with many voices, but I wonder how much creating those personas and setting them off to talk, these imaginative creatures, I wonder how that was. I get the sense that it must have been kind of extremely freeing and kind of trippy to begin doing that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was really, it was a discovery, and it was something, again, which I didn't think I would do. I was drawn to, I've always been drawn toward, those metaphysical dialogues by Edgar Allan Poe. This is like this conversation after death or something. And this is something there that always attracted me. And then there's an important Italian writer from the 19th century called Giacomo Leopardi, who wrote these really incredible metaphysical dialogues, conversations between imaginary characters and historical characters. And then there's another writer who wrote a number of impossible interviews. He's called Giorgio Manganelli. Impossible interview between an author and a number of historical / fictional creatures, Marco Polo, Harun al-Rashid, and I always found that form intriguing, and I never thought I was going to be able to write like that. So again, it was another of those impossible challenges that I wanted to try and meet. And in the case of the material that I introduced earlier, this impossibility sometimes of writing about the work, for example, of Cristina and Alejandra, the 2 poets, writers that I engage with in CHIMERAS. I just thought, well, if I can't write a straightforward anything, why don't I try and write an imaginary conversation, a series of imaginary conversations between myself as a character and the 2 of them. But how do I write this? How is that going to happen? So the fact that you already put yourself in a different position and you're somehow on the same level with them allowed me to say a number of things which I don't think I would have been able to say in an essay, from the most appreciative to the most conflicted opinions. They found their own space, and they found their own articulation there. Then there is the other type of conversation that happens in Nothing As We Needed, the other book on risking education. And that is interesting because basically I ask two figures, literature and chimera, to talk about my work. So again, it's like this kind of, rather than me saying what I'm doing, because a lot of my previous books had a lot of me writing about what I'm writing, or making observations about my writing. And I started to become a bit bored with, like it become a bit tedious as a form for me. So I just thought, well, why don't I try and have other people, characters, imaginary characters, say something about me, which was, again, it allowed me to be very judgmental with my own work, but also, try and maybe put myself in the condition of uttering thoughts which I don't think I would have been able to otherwise. And so and then there's the whole performative side of it, imagine yourself as a character. And I'm very naive. I'm not very, I'm not creative, right? I mean, I don't write fiction. I'm a critic. I call myself a critic. So this whole idea of suddenly using creative patterns to do something. So I'm sure that lots of people who operate in fiction will find a lot of these observations naive or probably commonplace. But for me, where I came from, to suddenly say, okay, I'm going to just say I'm a character, I'm going to start writing a number of characters, was very challenging at the beginning, but also it unlocked a number of ideas that I don't think I would have reached on a different basis, on a different ground, on different formal grounds. So I need to go back to the question of form, because it's very important here. I didn't have an idea or a driving thesis for these books. They had to take the shape that they took to be able to be what they are and channel what they are. I don't know if it's, I don't know if I'm making the point here, but I don't think that they could have been otherwise. They had to go through these formal trials and tribulations and moments of surprise. So what I'm trying to say is something about the daily writing practice, which is never daily. I mean, in your head, maybe it's daily, but that kind of obsessive. We don't write every day. But that's that obsessive engagement had to be done on a formal level, not just on a speculative level. And here we go back to the fact that speculative is not a good term because it's got a mirror in it. Whereas I think we're not talking about mirrors, we're talking about enmeshments and entanglements and resonance and interference, because that's the one thing that happens in the interviews. There's a lot of interference and interruption. So basically there was this idea that, which is not an idea, it's just this fact also that the material that I was looking at interrupted myself all the time. And I wanted somehow to represent that in a text. So there is not just this linear reading that I, as a critic, I'm going to give you about this text in a solemn and polished way. But it's like, no, there's this constant interruption and contradiction. And I wanted it to be there in the same way as I wanted the moments of stubbornness, the moments of nothing happens that we encounter as people who write about other people's writing. I wanted them to be there. I didn't want to edit them away, so I wanted these moments of, when you're stuck or you kind of keep repeating and you don't feel like you're going anywhere. All this somehow formally had to be incorporated in the books somehow. I don't know if I managed to, but there was definitely yeah, that intention.
Was it always a project with sort of two separate but enmeshed parts? Was it always twofold?
No, I think, honestly, I think that what I've been doing since Nabeem is writing the same book version. I'm writing with my books in English, different. I don't even know if they're chapters. I think they're different rooms.
You said wounds.
Rooms.
Oh,
like
rooms. I thought you said wounds.
No, different. No, different. I don't have the word for it, but maybe they're just. Yeah, I feel that I'm looking at something from various points of view. Well, listening to something from various points, actually. And yeah, I think that ideally, in X years' time, I might just gather everything together and it's going to be one book.
Right.
You know, I really feel that the more I go on with my work, the more I feel that it's not like, okay, this is the end of this project and that's the next. You know, I've never had that sense. There's always something that there are seeds from earlier books that have found much more space in these two. And of course, the fact that these two are happening together, that was interesting in itself, because it allowed me to really look at what can happen when two books are published within months.
Yeah.
And there are bits from one book that happen in the other in a different context, but you know, there are patterns. There are patterns that appear here and there, but there are patterns from previous books. So I think that ideally there's going to be one edit of whatever it is that's been published up to a certain point. I do see them as I see them in conversation.
You call them non-identical twins.
Yeah. It was the best way of describing them. Because they're similar, but they're not similar. So, but they inhabit the same, they inhabit the same spaces, and they have similar rhythms, even though you might argue that there's some slower moments in Chimeras, and Nothing As We Needed is more dynamic. But I think that there's a shared concerns about how to write. From what is this nothing that we need? This I think that that's maybe the shared aspect of the two, is what is this nothing, and how can I write it?
And as a reading experience, it was a really interesting one, because you can get on those like binges with a writer where you you'll read like 5 books by a writer back to back, but that's not the same as having these two related but aslant, kind of deeply enmeshed but slightly askew, two pieces of work, and reading them together. It's quite a singular sort of reading experience, and quite disorienting in a way that I think that you would quite enjoy.
Why is it disorienting? In which way is it disorienting?
It's like an attenuation of that sense that you get when you read a writer and or you read a bunch of books back to back, and you're not quite sure where you read what. You're not quite sure which book a certain thing was from. It's like that, but because of the you know, internally within each book, there's already this kind of like repetition and kind of refrains that come in and out, but and are sometimes kind of partial, sometimes full. And there's already these echoes and resonances going on, and then like it's, you know, it's like putting like two radios next to each other or something. Do you know what I mean? And like allowing the interference between them. It's like, it's quite a singular experience as a reader.
Well, I like what you say. I mean, I'm really interested in foregrounding the fact that something is transmitted rather than nailing down where it comes from.
Yeah.
The fact that there is this current that you're describing, rather than you being able to pin down where you read it.
Yeah.
Makes me quite happy, actually, because that's something that I was keen on doing. I mean, I don't know if I did it throughout, but you know, there's something that I find interesting in terms of obviously a number of ideas are being channeled through these.
Yeah.
But you don't know where exactly they first existed.
Yeah, it's almost like you're doing...
there's a strange spiraling and a loss of of references. Again, we're talking about reference and resonance. But there's a really strange spiraling that goes on, and you're no longer sure. Because I mean, I'm specifically writing about writers who themselves are haunted by literature, by a number of other writers, and one of the things that was very interesting for me looking at this first book by Calasso, which is not translated yet into English, the essays by Cristina Campo, which are not translated into English, and some of the prose by Alejandra Pizarnik, which is so far only Spanish. All of their prose, if you start looking closely, is heavy with voices of other writers. And it becomes really dizzying. They all were very experimental with how they inhabited their relationship with these other writers, to the point where you really no longer understand if Alejandra is writing from L'Autremont or if she's writing a commentary on L'Autremont, or if she's just taking some rhythms, you know, or if Calasso is obsessed with Godfrey Benn and there are patterns from the prose of Benn that come into Calasso's prose. So I'm just thinking, well, why don't I do that myself and start using some of these patterns into my own prose and see what happens there. So these writers engaging with other writers and myself in turn doing this operation of further entanglement somehow. It becomes very confusing, but also very, very exciting.
Yeah. I mean, actually hearing you speak of it, it occurs to me that like perhaps what I'm getting at is that the two books side by side kind of allow you to haunt yourself even more so than you're currently doing, like at a formal level. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, at the heart of it all, also there's this, you know, the very important symbol of the chimera, which is, again, it's another, you know, we don't even know how to pronounce it. Chimera. I love that, you know, the fact that a word so important, it already is creating this confusion in the way we think of pronouncing it. And in Italian, it's chimera. And in Italian, it's chimera, and it's something that I write at the beginning of the book. If you take the M out of chimera, it becomes chiera, and it means who was she? So it's like this, it's triggering this interrogation, and the M that drops is the M of mute and the M of mutation, and you have transformation. So there's a lot of work with language, with the formal language, the shape of language. But you know, the fact that the chimera is a monster. So it's something that is made of different parts, and it's very implausible, but at the same time, it's very real in the myth and in the unraveling of the myth. That already felt like a very strong and important image for me to use. And I call it an image heard in reading. So it's not an image seen, but it's an image heard in while reading. So you get all this senses, perception together. But also the fact that the second meaning of a chimera is the object of yearning. So there's this sense of a desire and the yearning that, you know, all of these writers that I engage with hold for the writers that they work with. And in turn, that's, you know, I was talking at the beginning of my desire for these writers to the point that it made me speechless. So, you know, so this sense of the chimera as, you know, the yearn, having at once the composite and the yearning became really important, but then it became even more important. And here I'm getting a bit, you know, irrational, but I was reading a letter by Cristina Campo, who is one of the writers I'm working with. And she talks about an extraordinary sonnet by a Renaissance female poet called Gaspara Stampa. And she talks about this sonnet to a friend as if it's one of the most accomplished and beautiful things, and it's exquisite and blah, blah, blah. So I went to look for this sonnet, which she doesn't quote in the letter. And the last verse of the sonnet is an image of echo and chimera. So it's like the chimera was written into the material of my study. I mean, I'm speechless again. It's like the material that I'm looking at dictates to me the form that my work is going to take. So I have chimera there. And in the same sonnet, she writes about feeling all and feeling nothing. So, I mean, can you see, I mean, you know, how can you not get driven into all this? You know, what I want to say is that as readers, there are these moments of sheer excitement and discovery, and I don't want to lose them. You know, I need to hold on to them, because they are part of what drives me. You know, the fact that something like that happens, I can't ignore. You know, and so many of these coincidences, you know, once you start spinning around this, you become like, you feel like you are in a mesh of echoes and connections in a very strange way. And I do try to write a bit about it in Nothing Else We Needed, you know, about how this chimera then started reappearing. Like, for example, in another poem by an Italian writer called Amelia Rosselli, where she writes about chimera. But she writes about chimera because she's working with literature and poetry, and she's echoing another poem from the early 20th century. So, you know, you get all this chain of kinships heard in reading, and it became important for me to try and carry all that, messy as it might be, because it's messy, it's not linear and tidy, but that's how it has to be. I couldn't tidy it up. It kept flowing and, you know, moving and rolling, and it was very unruly as material, but it was also very alive.
Yeah, you really get that impression as you're kind of like, because in the account that you give of kind of like following the thread and this like complete delight of discovery, you know, this kind of disbelief. Oh, it's here again, you know.
Yeah.
And it's really, you know, really joyful. I mean, there is always this sense in both books of you know, one book opens another, this kind of like this chain that you're following, this kind of open-ended quest, if you will. But there's also this one of the the kind of other tendencies within these works is the real sense that this is not every author, this is not every book, this is not about being comprehensive or about a knowledge that is accrual for accrual's sake. There's this real sense of, you know, this is my palette. These are the writers and the writing that I live in and with. And I know you're sat in your study now, I think, right, where we went to sit together. And I was thinking about, you know, during the pandemic, and we were talking about, you know, what do you do about books? You know, addicts. What are the addicts going to do about getting their books? And I remember really distinctly you saying, it doesn't matter. I don't need the library. I'm not going to order books and have them quarantined in my hallway for 48 hours because I have everything that I need. And it's about it. You know, I was really struck by that sense that for you, it's about living with these things. And I think in one of the books, I've forgotten which, forgive me, you talk about osmosis. You know, it's a kind of like a knowledge and a knowing that's kind of lived in over many years and many iterations and many repetitions and going back again. You know, it's about living, and I think you talk about it, you know, going down to the core of you, and it like no longer being separable from you as a person. You don't even need to you don't need to cite anymore because it's in you, you know.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to talk about here. Where to start? Yeah, I mean, that remark that you made about the singularity of a choice or a selection of, you know, material, that became really important. And again, it's something that I learned from Cristina Campo, who was writing about one of those extraordinary lectures by Gottfried Benn toward the end of his life, which I don't know why they're not translated from the German into English, as a brilliant meditations about literature and writing. And at one point, which is something that it's interesting because Ben says this in the lecture, and both Cristina and Calasso say exactly the same thing without at one point even referring to Ben. So I'm interested in how these ideas trickle into our thoughts to the point that we're no longer even saying, you know, I've talked about Gottfried Benn so much, I don't even need to mention him anymore. That's really interesting. Okay, that's another thing. I didn't want to say that, but yeah, detours. But what he says and what they repeat, they talk about the Greek Moira, which is, you know, the goddess of destiny in the sense of the Moira is the portion of life that is given to you. You know, this is like, this is the portion that you're given. This is what you cultivate. So this project of self learning and self cultivation of something that to learn to understand, to know, which you never do in full, but you know, that's why it was deemed to be one of the ultimate achievements of wisdom, you know, to know yourself, you know, to learn your limitations and to learn to know this portion, the portion that is given to you. What can you do there? And just work with it day after day after day after, you know, to do that rather than expansion. It's about intensification. So I think that, you know, that was really what I learned from Cristina, who writes a lot over and over. I mean, she repeated herself a lot. She's interesting. She didn't write a lot in her lifetime. I mean, she did write a lot under pseudonyms. And then you find bits from her essays repeated exactly the same in her letters. That's extraordinary. I mean, the fact that she's writing to a friend and she's using exactly the same couple of sentences that she's used in the essay, I think it's extraordinary. And yeah, and so she repeats this idea of the portion given to her, and you know, and how she could attend to it and read deeper. And at the beginning of one of her collections, she talks about how deliberately she did not choose to delete the repetitions across essays. because she said I wanted to be this kind of echoing chamber. I'm only waiting for the people to populate, for the readers to populate, and you know, and I think that became really important for me also. So I think that there's definitely this sense of how you can return to certain text over and over, which is probably stating the obvious, but you know, I think maybe going back to the somatic that we were talking about earlier, and how my relationship with certain significant books is really like, I will don't ever lend me a book. I mean, I will underline and make notes and bend the pages and make all sorts of symbols around it, just in terms of, you know, this kind of frequenting something, you know, attending something over and over and over. That is really important for me. And I think it can be reflected in the writing, in the fabric of the writing, perhaps, or in the rhythms of the writing. I think I've lost you. I think I've lost you. The rest of your remark or question. But was it? It was about reading less, or it was about?
It was a I mean,
asking about.
Daniela, you've definitely covered it, but it was about you know, having spoken about this kind of like opening out, this kind of expansive following of questing, about this kind of sense that you get in both books of exactly as you've spoken about, this like these limits, this like portion of stuff that you have with you and you stick with, and as you say, like this idea of like attending to something over and over again, and of these, you know,
but also to the point I want to say, and this is quite important, I think, when it becomes a bit ridiculous, like, you know, I think in Nothing as We Need It, especially, I laugh about myself a lot, and I kind of I quarter myself into, you know, I think there's also, I want to also say that it's not just this solemn and precious activity. I really hope that in the books there's also something else that comes through, you know, sometimes how ridiculous it can be, or how you can become so frustrated, and you know, sometimes the only thing to do is laugh. And you know, this idea at the very beginning of Nothing As We Needed of the body corsted by the four by the four disciplines, that's very true. You know, the fact that, you know, sometimes that's how you're feeling, you know, you're helpless and hopeless, and there's a sense of, there's a lot of slapstick, I think, in Nothing As We Needed. There's a lot of falling and and fainting, fake fainting. And you know, when there are these scenarios where you're asked a very interesting question and I don't know what to say, and I just make myself fall on the floor in a faint because I don't know. But yeah, I think there's that. There's definitely that. Yeah. Sorry, I think I interrupted you.
Not at all. I think Josh is trying to break in order to tell us that our time is up.
I was waiting for an opportune moment, and as much as I would love for this
Here it is.
to go on, we are at time. But everyone, I wanted to thank you. I wanted to especially, of course, thank Daniela and Jen for being wonderful interlocutors. Thank you all for attending. UK friends, just a heads up that we will be Sublunary Editions. We'll be at the Small Publishers Fair in London at the end of the month. That's the 28th and 29th, and Daniela will be doing a book signing on the 28th around 5:30. So do stop by. We'll have copies available for those for whom shipping has been abhorrently prohibitive. So come by, say hi, but thank you again so much. Thank you, Emil and Ansgar as well for joining and for also being partners in getting Daniela's work to as many readers as possible. Thanks. And if you missed part of this, this will be on YouTube later. That's all I've got. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.